Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. If it pleases the board, we'd like to deal with the Town of Burrillville's building inspector initial advisory opinion, the Town of Burrillville's supplemental advisory opinion, and the testimony of the Town of Burrillville's building inspector, because they were all done by the building inspector. So I'd like to call him to the stand and have him address all three. So I'd like to call Joe Raymond. Good morning, Mr. Raymond.
Good morning.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Joe Raymond. I'm the building zoning official in Town of Burrillville.
How long have you done that?
For 23 years.
Now, were you, in your capacity as the building inspector, asked by this board to prepare an advisory opinion?
I was.
And was the first advisory opinion that you prepared submitted to this board on September 9th, 2016, and marked as Burrillville Exhibit 29?
The date is fine. I'm not sure what the exhibit number is.
That's fair, I understand. And do you adopt that advisory opinion as your advisory opinion under oath today?
Yes, I do.
Now, you were asked to do a second supplemental advisory opinion by this board, is that correct?
That is correct.
And did Burrillville submit the second supplemental advisory opinion on August 15, 2017?
Yes, it was.
I will note that that's Burrillville Exhibit 30. And do you adopt the supplemental advisory opinion of August 15, 2017 under oath here today?
Yes, I do.
Do you have any corrections that you need to make to either of the advisory opinions?
No, I don't.
Your CB was submitted to this board as Burrillville Exhibit 31. Are there any changes to your CB?
No, they're not.
And you adopt it under oath?
Yes.
Now, you also submitted a surrebuttal testimony on behalf of the Town of Burrillville on September 27, 2017, correct?
That's correct.
And do you adopt that surrebuttal testimony under oath here today?
Yes, I do.
And for the record, that's Burrillville Exhibit 19. Do you have any changes or corrections you need to make to the surrebuttal testimony?
No, they're not.
At this time, I'll return Mr. Raymond over for cross-examination.
I have a few questions for Mr. Raymond, if I may. Mr. Raymond, do you have a copy there of your supplemental advisory opinion, the Burrillville Exhibit 30 from August of 2017?
Yes.
I apologize, I should have introduced myself. My name is Jerry Elmer, and I'm a lawyer for Conservation Law Foundation. I'd like to ask you to look at page 2 of your supplemental advisory opinion. Starting in paragraph 2, you said, on March 27, 2017, Invenergy submitted a preliminary stormwater management plan with a preliminary soil erosion and sediment control plan to the Energy Facility Siting Board. As to whether it will comply with the ordinance remains to be seen for a number of reasons. Some of these issues are as follows, new paragraph. referencing the quote, new unquote, proposed lot for the Creek site, the topsoil stockpile area appears to be smaller than originally proposed, as is the construction staging area. It is unclear how the site contractor will be able to move around the site. Is that still true today?
I have not seen, there have been changes that were done to the proposed lot, the one that was referenced by Mr. Lipsitz in regards to the placement of those areas. I'm not sure where they are because the actual original plan that he mentioned that was submitted back in 2016 references a different shaped area than the now meets and bounds description in that general area as to where the wetlands are, where the dry area is, and how the area is going to be approached, which based on the original or based on their proposal, it appeared that it was going to be part of the responsibility of the site contractor to determine how to do that.
Thank you. And in the next paragraph, back in August of 2017, you said the directions given as to how the project will progress are again vague. Is that still true today with the latest plan that you have from Invenergy?
The reason I mentioned that is in the preliminary plan, it mentioned that the project would be staged. In the later one, it mentioned that it would not be, it would be some continuous staging. However, many times they reference different stages at which times things are going to be done. So again, I'm basing the fact that there's no specific plan at this point as to how this is going to proceed.
Look at the bottom of page 6, please. Last paragraph at the bottom of page 6, you say, as of the present time, it is impossible to state that the SESC plan provided by the applicant fulfills the requirements of the ordinance because of the lack of definiteness and detail. Therefore, it is my opinion that it does not pass muster, unquote. Now, when you say SESC, you're referring to the soil erosion and sediment plan, is that right?
That's correct.
And the applicant, of course, is Invenergy.
Correct.
Is it still your opinion today that those plans submitted by Invenergy do not pass muster?
Yes.
Thank you. On the next page, page 7, in the second paragraph, you say, I requested assistance from the town planner, Ray Goff, regarding what would the process, absent the act, be for the applicant to subdivide the lot. I've included his memo as Exhibit A at the end of this opinion. You see that?
Yes, sir.
Then in the next paragraph, you go on and you say, based on available information, it is Mr. Goff's position that the applicant would require an administrative subdivision to reconfigure the lot lines. Regarding the process for the subdivision, he notes that, quote, as of this date, information relevant to the submission of these applications has not been forthcoming. With respect to this, the planning board has not been provided with enough information to adequately evaluate the project for compliance with local land laws and processes, unquote. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
And as of today, has the planning board still not been provided with enough information to adequately evaluate the project for compliance with local laws and processes?
I last spoke with Mr. Goff regarding this, and it's his position that nothing has been submitted that would change his position.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I would object to this witness testifying to what Mr. Goff may or may not have said. That's hearsay.
We have here an expert witness who, under the rules, is allowed to rely on the type of information generally relied upon by witnesses in that field. This is the town building inspector who appended to his sworn testimony a letter from the town planner, Mr. Goff. He is relying on that testimony. He's relying on conversations with Mr. Goff, and Invenergy has had no objection to the planner relying, as the rules permit him to do, on the kind of information that planners would normally use.
Oh,
So my question is, as of today, has the planning board still not been provided with enough information to adequately evaluate the project for compliance with local laws and processes? Is that still true today?
According to Mr. Goff, it is.
And do you have an opinion as to whether that's true today?
I have not received any information in this area. I would assume that I would be reviewing it or looking at it with Mr. Goff if they had received something.
In your professional experience, how common is it for a planning board not to be provided with enough information to adequately evaluate a project for compliance with local laws and processes?
Minimal amount of I'm not a planner, and I do not, I try to make it a point to keep somewhat separate from that because of the difference in zoning and planning. However, I've never seen enough information. I've never seen enough information not being supplied to meet the requirements that a planning board requires for them to make a determination as to whether it's provable or not.
And if permitting authority remained with the town of Burrillville, what would the town of Burrillville do in a situation where an applicant does not provide enough information so that the town can adequately evaluate a project for compliance with local laws and processes?
The submittal would be returned to the applicant with directions.
To comply with the town's laws?
Correct.
The bottom of page 7, you say it's been almost a year since I noted that Invenergy failed to submit the proper requests for relief from the Burrillville Zoning Board in their application. You see where it says that?
Yes, I do.
Is that still true today?
That I am familiar with personally. Yes, that has not been done.
In your professional experience, how common is it that an applicant fails to submit the proper request for relief from the Burrillville Zoning Board in its application?
It is not that common.
And if Burrillville retained permitting authority in this case, what would it do in the face of an applicant, in this case Invenergy, that failed to submit the proper request for relief from the zoning board?
Typically under zoning law, if there's a disagreement as to what is necessary and what is not, either at the level of the application from the zoning board or determination by me as a zoning official, and appeal to the zoning board, and then through the judicial system is the next step.
Has Burrillville ever granted zoning approval to an applicant that didn't submit a proper request for relief?
Not to my knowledge, they have.
Turn to the bottom of page 15. You start a new subhead called summary and conclusion. Is that correct? Correct. And at the top of page 16, the sentence that begins on line 1 of page 16, you say, I would recommend that the EFSB direct Invenergy to submit an administrative subdivision application and plan to the Burrillville Planning Board per the requirements of 15-6.3 in the Burrillville subdivision regulations, allowing the planning board to review and advise the EFSB whether the plan submitted by Invenergy would be, absent the act, acceptable for subdivision approval, and if not, what else would be needed for compliance. Is that still your position today?
Yes, it is.
So you would like the EFSB to direct Invenergy to submit proper documentation so that the Burrillville Planning Board could render a proper advisory opinion. Is that right?
That's correct.
In the next paragraph, you say, Invenergy failed to submit the proper information for zoning relief in its application to the Burrillville Zoning Board. Is that still true today?
I guess the best way to explain it would be to say that when the application was submitted back in 2016 at the request of the siting board, two things were required or was submitted from Invenergy as to what was necessary absent the act. One was a special use permit because energy electric generating facility is a use allowed by special use permit in the EFI district, and dimensional relief in the sense of height restrictions because of the size of some of the components of this project. At the time that I submitted my first advisory opinion, I noted other areas that needed to be reviewed. I think that, I'm not going to say that because I'm only guessing at this point because I never could say that. My position is still the same, that information that I submitted basically saying that the proposal to create what I see there as two power plants requires a use variance based on the zoning district that it's in and our zoning ordinance. They also say that nothing has been demonstrated as to specifically where the limits of the aquifer A district in that area. There is a process to do this, but Invenergy has never come forward and requested that. Instead, their position is that they don't object, and therefore nothing is in question, which I disagree with. Third, there was a third potential use variance that I mentioned also, which again, I have no way of knowing at this point in time because the wetland permit has never been finalized from DEM. And from my understanding, at the time back in 2016 during the hearings, we were told that wetland flagging had been completed in the area where the parcel was going to be. But when I spoke with DEM at that time, they said that it hadn't been done yet, or partially had been done, and they referenced a letter from 2015 where some of the work was done. However, there were other wetlands on the site that needed to be identified. Until I actually see a plan that was approved by DEM stating these are the wetlands on the site and these are the setbacks, I don't believe it's possible to say that it does not contain less than 40%. That's my position as a zoning official. I do not have that information here, and there is enough wetlands on the site in that area that until such time as it's been proven otherwise, I would still stand by that.
So you've said a number of things in this last answer, and you referenced the A80 aquifer overlay zone. With your permission, I'd like to come back to that in a moment. We discussed that in a different section of your supplemental advisory opinion. What I'd like to do now is focus your attention on page 16, second paragraph, the first sentence, that says, Invenergy failed to submit the proper information for zoning relief in its application to the Burrillville Zoning Board. And ask you very simply whether sitting here today, that statement is still true.
Yes.
Thank you.
There's only been one application and the information was not available on it.
In your experience, how common is it for an applicant for zoning relief to, quote, not submit the proper information, unquote?
While it's uncommon, there are times when it's not there, but if the applicant does not ask for a continuance to come back with it, I've never seen a situation where they got approved.
You've never seen a situation where zoning relief has been approved in the absence of proper information being submitted by the applicant?
Correct.
If the Town of Burrillville retained zoning authority, that is, the Energy Facility Siting Act had not given that authority to this board, would Burrillville grant Invenergy zoning relief in this circumstance?
No.
And it's your recommendation at the top of page 16 that the EFSB direct Invenergy to submit proper information before the EFSB goes ahead with any permitting decision. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's turn to the matter that you raised about the A80 aquifer overlay zone, which you discuss on page 8 of the same exhibit. In the middle of the page, in bold-faced letters, you say the applicant requires a variance to construct the CREC, C-R-E-C, because this use is not allowed in an aquifer A80 overlay zone. You see where you say that?
Yes.
And you were in the room earlier when Mr. Lipsitz testified that this is not correct because Invenergy had relied on GIS mapping. Were you here when he said that?
Yes, I did hear that.
And am I correct that you do not agree with Mr. Lipsitz?
Correct.
Why?
I disagree that in his testimony, I disagree that a GIS drawing superimposed over a GIS map complies with the zoning ordinance that references the town map, which is the Dickerman, Johnston, Branch River water supply map from the 1970s, superimposed onto the town zoning map.
If legal authority remained with Burrillville to address this issue of the A80 overlay zone, what would you require Invenergy to do?
Invenergy would be required to request determination as to the limits of the aquifer in that area. And as what's happened in the past, we would hire a hydrogeologist who would work with the client to determine protocol as to where drilling would have to be done to determine the extent of the existing aquifer in that area. If it can be determined with one set of drillings, fine. If not, then they would need to continue it a little further to determine the limit of the property, to determine whether the proposed site is going to be within that actual overlay district or not.
As you may know, my client, Conservation Law Foundation, has urged the EFSB not to approve the permit. But if the EFSB were inclined to grant a permit to Invenergy, would you urge the EFSB to require such a hydrologic study to be done in order that this issue of the A80 aquifer overlay could be satisfactorily resolved before the board goes ahead with any permitting decision?
Absolutely, I agree with that.
And is it your expert opinion that such a study by a qualified hydrologist could resolve what is now a disagreement between you and Mr. Lipsitz?
It definitely can be done that way, yes.
And would resolving that disagreement between you and Mr. Lipsitz before any decision is made on permitting, would that be appropriate?
I believe it should be done that way, yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions for this witness.
Other questions for this witness?
Could you just give me a minute?
Sorry. Does Invenergy have a question? Does Invenergy go?
Okay, you may go first.
For the record, Madam Chair, I've asked Ms. Birdie to provide Mr. Raymond with a hard copy of the Burrillville zoning code. Referring to that quite a bit in my cross, so it'll be easier for him if he has it there with him. And it'll be up on the screen.
Thank you.
Like you want a copy? And Good morning, Mr. Raymond. And for the record, what you've been handed is actually the entire Burrillville Code of Ordinances. I thought, just for the sake of completeness, we'd give you the whole thing, but the zoning code, you'll see it's got page numbers at the bottom. The zoning code actually starts at page 270. Could you just confirm that for us?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that code dates back to 2004, correct? It's on the...
This ordinance,
Yes.
it dates further back.
Right. But the entire code book, the entire set of Burrillville ordinances...
Codification of the town ordinances, correct.
2004.
Correct.
And you were in... You were in your position with the town as of then, correct?
I was, yes.
You started in 1995?
Correct.
Did you provide input into the drafting of this version of the zoning code?
I did not.
And I think you agree that the language of the ordinance, and especially the definitions, has to be interpreted literally, correct?
Yes, I do.
So if you could go to page 281, I'll wait till the board members have it. And just for the sake of the board member, what we did there, rather than giving you the entire book, since I'm not going to be asking about the other ordinances, we've just given you the excerpt, the zoning code, with the page numbers at the bottom. So if you could go to page 281, please, sir. Section 30-32, enforcement, and it identifies the zoning enforcement officer, and the building official is hereby designated as the zoning enforcement officer. The zoning enforcement officer shall enforce the provisions of this chapter. And that's you, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you report to Mr. Wood?
Yes.
He reports to the town board?
Town council. Yes.
Town council, excuse me. Now, there were several items, obviously, that were filed by the town in this matter, and I'd like to find out what your role or involvement was in each of those. First one is Town Building Inspector Advisory Opinion, September 9, 2016. That's your initial advisory opinion, correct?
Okay. Yes.
And did you prepare that by yourself?
I did, yes.
And then we have Town Building Inspector Supplemental Advisory Opinion, that's Town Exhibit 30, August 15, 2017. Did you prepare that one by yourself?
That one I prepared the language, however, I was busy at the time to try to formulate it down, so I had somebody type it up for me.
Ms. Birdie's going to hand out Mr. Raymond a letter from your attorney, Mr. McElroy, dated May 18, 2018. I'll wait till she hands it out, and I'll ask you some questions about it. I'll wait till you have a moment to review that, Mr. Raymond. I'll ask you a couple questions about it. have a chance to look at it?
Yes.
And this is an invoice, or set of invoices from the attorney named Patrick J. Doherty, correct?
Correct.
And it's in connection with services rendered with respect to the preparation of your supplemental advisory opinion, correct?
Correct.
And based on the descriptions of the activities here, Mr. Doherty didn't just type that opinion for you, did he?
No.
It appears from...
Excuse me, though, my understanding was you were asking about, when you mentioned the fact that we had to first submit a the status report for that was because it kind of went in 3 steps there. The original one, so it's, but as far as, I think we haven't gotten to this point, as far as the supplemental advisory opinion, I did receive assistance, correct.
Ah, okay. So now you do remember, based on this, that you didn't prepare that supplemental on your own, correct?
I did not do that. I was kind of waiting for that question because I misunderstood. I thought you were asking me about it.
And in fact, there are a number of entries in this. I'm sorry, were you done with answering the question?
I'm done.
Okay. There are a number of entries in this, in these invoices, where Mr. Doherty is billing for drafting, revising, and editing your supplemental advisory opinion. Did he in fact do that?
Yes, he did.
So is it fair to state that the advisory opinion is not just your work, it's the result of Mr. Doherty's work, correct?
Again, we're talking about supplemental advisory opinion.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Moving on, Town Exhibit 19, that's your sewer bubble testimony. Did you do that one on your own, or did Mr. Doherty help you with that one?
There were actually 3 portions of this, but my understanding is while I would have assumed that I had assistance from the Mr. McElroy's office to put this together because it was submitted that way.
So it's entirely possible that you didn't prepare the sewer bubble testimony either, is that correct?
No, I did prepare it, but I did not put it into this format.
All right. I'm not talking about formatting, I'm talking about content. We have Mr. Doherty drafting, editing, and revising your supplemental advisory opinion. I'm trying to find out if anyone else drafted, edited, or revised your sewer bubble testimony.
I don't see any, no, I did not.
So that's entirely yours.
Yes.
And just a couple of others. Town Exhibit 27 is your zoning board advisory opinion. Did you have any input into that?
The original advisory opinion?
The zoning board advisory.
The one in 2016.
I'm only aware of
I
one.
believe that's the only one.
Right.
The only input that I had in it was I assisted then solicitor Nicolishan in formatting, putting the stuff together.
You had nothing to do with the content?
I'm sure I had something to do with the content, just taking like information from the hearing and what occurred during the zoning meetings. The legal part.
I'm talking about the content now. So let's use the words that Mr. Doherty billed for with respect to your supplemental advisory opinion. Did you have any role in drafting, editing, or revising the town zoning board advisory opinion?
Did it have any role? Yes, it did.
And with respect to Town Exhibit 26, the town planning board advisory opinion, did you have any role in drafting, editing, or revising that opinion?
That one I did not know.
I'm sorry, which document was that?
The last one was Town Exhibit 26, Town Planning Board Advisory Opinion. we pull up Town of 34?
Which exhibit, wait,
I'm sorry, Exhibit 34 is the town's resolution.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry, I should be more specific. And we'll get it, it's up on the screen as well. You recognize that, Mr. Raymond?
I've seen that before, yes.
Has that resolution and overall the town's opposition to this project had any impact on your opinions or testimony in this matter?
It's a confusing question. It was written after my advisory opinion. If anything, I would say maybe my opinion had some effect on the town council.
Well, let's try it this way in terms of time. This resolution was in place when you and Mr. Doherty drafted your supplemental advisory opinion, and it was in place when you drafted your rebuttal testimony. So, did this resolution, the town council's formal opposition, town board, excuse me, town
Council.
You know, I practiced in so many states, I can never remember whether it's a board or a council. The town's formal opposition to this project, did that have any impact on the statements in your supplemental advisory opinion or in your sort of other testimony?
No.
Your entire set of submittals in this case is entirely of your own volition, unblemished or untarnished by any position that's been taken by your superiors. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Let's go back to the code, the zoning code, zoning ordinance. I want to go through a couple of definitions. We're going through a few, but just a couple for now. Page 279. And there's a definition there of zoning ordinance. Do you see it?
Yes, I do.
And it says, zoning ordinance means an ordinance enacted by the town council pursuant to GL 4524-1 et sequitur, and in the manner providing for the adoption of ordinances in the town's charter, which sets forth regulations and standards relating to the nature and extent of uses of land and structures, which is consistent with the comprehensive plan of the town. I'll stop there for now. And that is, in fact, this zoning ordinance that we're looking at today, correct?
That is correct.
Consistent with the comprehensive plan of the town as of when this ordinance was adopted, correct?
Correct.
And this ordinance remains in full force and effect today, correct?
That's correct.
And then along the same lines, page 270, section 30-2, purpose. Let me know when you're there.
I'm here.
Okay. This chapter has been developed and shall be maintained in accordance with the town's comprehensive plan, correct?
Correct.
And this ordinance has in fact been developed and maintained in accordance with the town's comprehensive plan, correct?
Correct.
Page 279, I'm going to go back. With apologies to the board, I think you all now know I bounce around a lot, so I do apologize. Definition of zoning use districts. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And that's a standard definition of zoning use districts, correct?
That would reference the Rhode Island State Enabling Act for zoning.
Right. And it's the Rhode Island Zoning Enabling Act that, in essence, defines the authority of local units of government with respect to zoning, correct?
I will say yes, but I am not perfectly clear as to how much authority the state has in general over zoning, because they allow a number of specific things of which the town can then define in their own way how they want to handle it.
Understood. It provides the general guidance. Is that a fair statement?
Guidance is an excellent way.
Okay. And then if we go to page 279, I think this bleeds over a bit into 280, section 30-31. This is zoning districts and zoning map.
Yep.
And it says, districts generally, for the purpose of this chapter, the town is divided into 10 zoning districts and 4 overlay districts designated as follows. There's a series of districts identified, correct?
Correct.
And one of those is F5 farming/residential, correct?
Correct.
And F5 is where we're proposing to construct this facility that's the subject of this proceeding, correct?
That is correct.
And then if we, starting on page 292, we'll come back to this, but I just want to identify it right now for the record. Section 30-71, there's a table there, zoning district uses.
Yes.
And it goes all the way, goes for several pages, so my notes say up until 305. But that's a table identifying all of the uses in each of the individual zoning districts, correct?
It identifies the uses and where it's allowed, not allowed,
Right.
allowed by special use.
And we'll go through that. All right. Actually, we'll talk about those specifically right now, because as you point out, that table identifies uses, and where it has a Y, it's a permitted use, right?
That's correct.
Where it has an S, it's a permitted by special use permit, correct?
That's correct.
And when it has an N, it's prohibited, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now the word prohibited isn't defined in your ordinance, but I think we can all agree what prohibited means. Permitted use is defined in your ordinance, correct? Make it easy, page 277. Yeah.
Yes.
Permitted use means a use by right, which is specifically authorized in a particular zoning district, correct?
Correct.
So if it's a permitted use by right, I can do it without getting a special use permit.
That's correct.
I might need a building permit, but otherwise I can build whatever is allowed in that zoning district, correct?
Well, there may be other restraints, wetlands, site plan review, depending on the magnitude of the general project, but basically, yes.
There is no zoning use restriction.
Correct.
All right. And then on 278, we have a definition of special use. And I believe it's consistent with what you just testified a few moments ago. It's a regulated use which is permitted pursuant to a special use permit issued by the authorized government entity, correct?
Correct.
And obviously, just so we're clear, a special use is not a prohibited use.
Correct.
It just requires a special use permit.
Correct.
And the zoning ordinance actually has a series of procedures for getting a special use permit, is that right?
Yes.
We don't have to go there, but this may sound familiar, section 16-48 on special use permits, and section 30-34. That sound familiar? Go ahead and take a look. Page 186 is 16-48. I'm not going to spend any time on it, I just want you to confirm that that section addresses special use permits.
I'm sorry, what's the page is?
Page 186, Madam Chair. I'm sorry. Yeah, actually, that's outside the zoning code. I apologize. Let's go to it. So there's a provision outside the zoning code that addresses special use permits. Let's go to a different one. Page 285, section 30-34E. And this talks about the circumstances under which the zoning board of review may issue a special use permit, right?
Talking about the general powers of the zoning board?
Yes. So now, let's go back to that table of uses, starting at page 292.
Glad I took this clip off.
You can put the rest of it aside. We're just going to be focusing on the zoning ordinance. So. All right. So if we go through that table, you see across the top it identifies which zone we're talking about.
Correct.
All right. So I'm just going to be focusing on the F5. I want to go just through some of the things that may be permitted by special use, or permitted, or prohibited. So, for example, in the F5, and it's separated by types of uses, right? So, section 1, for example, is agricultural uses.
Correct.
All right. And so, for example, the very first one there, this is on page 293, raising of animals subject to the premises being kept in a humane sanitary manner. That's identified here as a special use in the F5.
That's correct.
Right. And there's a reference to a footnote, footnote 1. And I guess that's at the very end of the table.
It is.
And footnote 1 says, if acreage is...
Where is the footnote 1?
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. Page 305. And footnote 1 says, if acreage is 5 acres or more, the use is permitted. And then there's a Y in parentheses.
Correct.
So if we go back to that table on page 293, if I want to raise animals on a lot in the F5, so long as it's more than 5 acres, that's a permitted use, it's not a special use, correct?
That's correct. And you just basically said a lot. I'm assuming you're saying a lot of the residents on the principal use.
Well, I'm looking at principal use, which is the left-hand column, right? Of this table, right? And then the first principal use I see in this table is raising of animals subject to the premises being kept in a humane sanitary manner, correct?
Right.
Right. So I could raise animals on a greater than 5 acre lot without getting any kind of a zoning permit, right?
An empty lot, you're saying?
Something in the F5 zone.
There are other things that do affect local zoning. That would be Supreme Court cases, for example.
I'm not talking about that right now, Mr. Raymond. I'm just talking about the zoning ordinance that, by definition, you're required to enforce.
I'm sorry, he was cut off. Could I object? He was cut off in the middle of his answer, so he should at least be allowed to finish.
I apologize.
In the 1990s, there was a Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court has determined that you cannot have an accessory structure, an accessory use of the property without principal use. And in raising animals, the Ivy Foster case, they specifically, Hein v. Foster case, that the raising of the animals is an accessory use, and therefore you must first have control of the property, i.e. somebody has to be living there.
Okay.
So that's the only point I was making.
Oh, then I apologize for interrupting you. So if I had a farmhouse
Correct.
on this property, and then I had a lot that's over 5 acres, I could then raise animals. Sure. So,
You have a raised ranch and you could do it.
okay. So, for example, I could have a 700-acre, subject to wetland regulation and all that, I could have a 700-acre concentrated animal feeding operation as a permitted use in the F5 district. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what that means.
Concentrated animal feeding operation?
We don't really
Heard of
have
that.
those here.
As you can tell, I've done a lot of work in Iowa. A hog farm.
I don't know again, because again, it would go back to something of that magnitude and require a site plan review by the planning board first. If that is approved, then I would think that would be an allowable thing, yes.
Okay. Let's move on from that one. That one was harder than I expected. Section 2, residential uses.
No hogs.
Page 294. Single-family detached dwelling, that's permitted use.
Correct.
Multi-family dwelling, a little bit farther down, that's a prohibited use.
Correct.
No apartment buildings.
Correct.
Okay. Up at the top of 295, group home, community residence, or family daycare residence, that's a permitted use.
Correct.
Boarding house is prohibited, right?
The boarding house, not more than 2 doors is prohibited, yes.
Hotel or motel is prohibited.
Yes, it is.
Halfway house, residential treatment facility, special use. Next section, open recreation uses. Commercial picnicking area, overnight or family camping areas, special use.
Correct.
Drive-in theater, prohibited. I miss drive-in theaters.
Same here.
Let me see, the next one, section 4, public and semi-public use. Let's go to page 297. Hospital and health clinics subject to development plan review, that's a permitted use.
Correct.
Item 13 there, electric generating facility, that's a special use.
That's correct.
We're gonna come back to that one. This one, just because of what my company does in other places. Number 17 on page 298. Commercial scale and large scale solar energy systems are prohibited.
Correct.
All right, let's go back, going back to electric generating facility, the one we just mentioned. That phrase, electric generating facility, is defined in the ordinance, correct?
Yes.
It's page 274. Let me know when you're there.
I am there.
Okay. Electric generating facility means any generating facility designed to generate electric energy in excess of 180 megawatts annually. Correct?
That's correct.
All right. We'll come back to that one in a little bit. I want to get through, kind of in a macro way, some of the subjects that are, some of the topics that are the subject of the things that you and, with respect to your supplemental, you and Mr. Doherty filed here. Multiple discussions in what you submitted about wetlands. So, for example, Town Exhibit 29, your initial advisory opinion, page 7. Let me know when you're there.
I'm here.
All right, it's it starts the Town of Burrillville zoning ordinance 30-153. You see where I'm referring to?
I do.
Lots containing wetlands states, for any lot which, quote, for any lot which has been determined by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management to contain a wetland. If the wetland area, including wetland buffer, is greater than 40% of the total area, the following restrictions shall apply. And the one that you highlight here is only single-family housing will be allowed in all residential zones, correct?
Correct.
And then, if we could go to your supplemental advisory opinion, page 2. There's a part that starts Invenergy Thermal Development, LLC, Invenergy, and I do apologize for that. Submitted a draft copy of their preliminary stormwater management plan to the EFSB on September 27, 2016. Do you see that part?
I did.
All right. And down at the sentence I want to focus on there, the project would be subject to the town's SESC ordinance. However, there are a number of questions regarding the proposed site and wetland issues that have not been addressed. Did I read that correctly?
First paragraph again?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
okay. I think this was established during Mr. Elmer's questioning. You do know that that Invenergy has a freshwater wetlands permit application pending with the Department of Environmental Management, correct?
I do. Well, I guess it's with Algonquin right now. I assume it's the same thing. Unless maybe there's another one that I don't know.
There's only one. It's a joint application. All right.
Well, I have to use Algonquin.
That's fine. They come first. They come before Invenergy in the alphabet, right?
That must be it.
Okay. And if I were to tell you that the facility lot will in fact contain less than 40% wetland area, are you in any position as you sit here today to dispute that?
No, I'm not.
And you do agree that if it is less than 40%, then section 30-153 that we just looked at of the zoning ordinance does not apply.
Correct.
Okay. I want to go through some of the other dimensional limits in the ordinance. This is these are all at section 30-111. It's the section on dimensional limits. It is, for some reason, after having reviewed these notes 1,000 times, I've missed a page number. Pages 310 to 312. For example, minimum lot size in the F5 is 5 acres. Correct. That's the required. And you're aware that this project, as proposed, is just a little bit over 67 acres. Correct?
Correct.
All right. Minimum lot frontage, 450 feet.
That's correct.
And this project, as proposed, will have a minimum lot frontage of 450 feet. You're aware of that?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Minimum setback front yard is 40 feet.
Correct.
And you're aware that our proposed minimum setback is just a hair over 1,688 feet.
I don't know the exact number, but yes, it's pretty far back.
Okay. Minimum setback rear yard, again, the required is 40 feet.
That's correct.
And ours will be just over 51 feet.
Again, there's a mark on the map that demonstrates the setback, and you're within it, but how far you're within it, I can't, I didn't measure.
But we meet the requirement.
You meet the requirement.
Okay. Minimum setback side yard each is 15 feet.
Correct.
And will be approximately 50 feet.
And you're certainly beyond the 15-foot setbacks.
All right. Minimum building coverage required is 20%. Right.
Here.
Yes. You got it?
This is very different than zoning ordinance manual printed on a computer.
Right. Right. You know, I'll tell you candidly, I went to the town website, clicked on the link for zoning ordinance, and it took me to this. So that's the one we used.
Well, certainly it's
Right.
done on the computer.
Okay.
GIS drawings and stuff like that. You click on that, it's there.
Right. So minimum building coverage required is 20%. Right.
Sorry, you say
Maximum, I apologize. Maximum building coverage, 20%.
yes.
Appreciate the help. Our proposed is 1%. You're aware of that? You know that it's well under 20%?
Yes.
We talked about wetlands. You spent quite a bit of time, both in the submittals that you and Mr. Doherty made and in response to Mr. Elmer's questions about your assertion that Invenergy did not submit adequate plans. Describing that in a shorthand way, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Okay. So let's look, for example, it's again sprinkled throughout all three of those documents, but let's look at your SIR rebuttal exhibit 19. Page 2, lines 14 to 19. It is ridiculous to suggest, let me know when you're there, first of all. Okay. It is ridiculous to suggest that a portion of a very large existing 700-plus acre tract of land that had not been specifically identified as a parcel at that point in time was all that was necessary for the regulatory agencies to adequately review this parcel and provide advisory opinions to the Energy Facility Siting Board, such as the Burrillville Planning and Zoning Boards, the Building Inspector, and the Department of Environmental Management. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, sir.
I'm looking at the list. This is a list that was circulated yesterday. The list of board exhibits. I just want to know if you're aware of what I'm about to read you. Things that have been filed in this docket. DEM advisory opinion. You're aware of that?
That'd be a little more specific.
That I'm sorry. So I'm going from the statement that I just read, that it is ridiculous, paraphrasing now, that the regulatory agencies could be asked to submit advisory opinions based on what we've provided. So I'm asking if you're aware that
So you're talking about the DEM advisory opinion?
Right. You know it's been
Due
submitted.
in 2016?
Right. You know it's been submitted. Correct?
Correct.
And you know that DEM then filed a supplemental advisory opinion. Correct?
Yes.
And statewide planning supplied an advisory opinion. Correct?
Yes.
A supplemental advisory opinion. Correct?
I'm not as sure, but I would assume that you're correct.
And a second supplemental advisory opinion. Correct?
Maybe you could explain what the second supplemental is.
I'm only asking if you know that in fact statewide planning filed 3 separate advisory opinions in this document.
I would say 2 yes, 3 I'm not sure.
Okay. Department of Transportation filed an advisory opinion, right?
Yes.
And a supplemental advisory opinion? Correct?
Yes.
Department of Health filed an advisory opinion, right?
Yes.
And a supplemental advisory opinion? Correct?
I'm going to assume that, and that's not really safe to do, but I will take your word for it.
Well, Mr. Lipsitz thought it was safe, so maybe you can too. Since I'm reading from an official list, that means you can assume this one's safe.
Then
Okay.
I'm not, nobody has ever approached me and said that there's something wrong with this list,
Okay.
that something was not submitted. That might be the best way for me to answer it, because many of these things aren't pertinent to what I'm dealing with
I understand that,
in
sir.
this thing, so I have not spent that time to review certain things that really doesn't fall in my category.
That's a fair answer. I appreciate that. So just to finish off that list, Office of Energy Resources advisory opinion. You can accept my statement that
Yes.
that one was filed. Public Utility Commission advisory opinion.
Yes.
And then finally, Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission advisory opinion.
I will take your word for that also.
Thank you. All right, let's talk about the A80 overlay district. And you say, I'm going to quote from one of the things you submitted, but I think you made that very clear today. It's your position that the limit of the aquifer A80 overlay district over this parcel being where we propose to develop this facility, is in doubt and disputed.
Could you direct us to where that?
Sure. Sir rebuttal testimony, page 20.
Thank you.
It's the part that starts to characterize the changes that have been submitted. You see that, Mr. Mendo?
Well, we did.
Okay. All right.
Yes, I have.
Okay. And then, same document, your Sir rebuttal, back to page 8, lines 1 to 4. Moreover, the attempted reconfiguration of the now proposed lot is such that it is completely in conflict with the goals, recommendations, and requirements of the subdivision regulations, because the lot created is haphazardly drawn in such a manner as to make it shaped like a jigsaw puzzle piece and in no way uniform to other lots in the area. Did I read that correctly, Mr. Raymond?
Yes, you did.
All right. The zoning ordinance regulates lot area, correct?
Yes.
Lot frontage, we covered some of that just a few minutes ago. Lot depth to width ratio.
That is not in this ordinance, no.
All right. But in terms of the specific lot requirements, those are some of the things we looked at that are in section 3-111, right?
Table of dimensional regulations.
Correct, correct. Where's the ordinance provision on lot shape?
That would be in the subdivision regulations.
Is there something in the zoning ordinance that regulates lot shape?
No.
Now you were here, I understand, when Mr. McElroy was cross-examining Mr. Lipsitz this morning, right?
Yes, I was.
And did you hear Mr. McElroy, I wrote down the word here, suggest, so I'm not going to use that word. Did you hear Mr. McElroy asking Mr. Lipsitz questions about whether the Burrillville ordinance discourages or prohibits irregularly shaped lots? Remember those questions?
I do remember that, yes.
Isn't it true that the zoning ordinance in fact contemplates the existence of irregularly shaped lots?
I don't understand the question.
It contemplates it. It recognizes that they are a possibility. It does not prohibit them. Isn't that correct?
It does not prohibit them. No, it doesn't prohibit them because it's not in the purview of the zoning ordinance.
Well, let's see, page 276 of the zoning ordinance. Definition of lot line. Now I'm just focusing on here. First of all, lot line means a line of record bounding a lot, which divides one lot from another lot, or from a public or private street or any other public or private space, and shall include, and then a list of things, right?
Yep.
And then for the rear, it says the lot line opposite and most distant from the front line, or in the case of triangular or otherwise irregularly shaped lots, an assumed line at least 10 feet in length entirely within the lot, parallel to and at a maximum distance from the front lot line. Did I read that correctly?
Fine.
Okay. And are you, I know you indicated you're not completely up to speed on the Rhode Island Zoning Enabling Act, but are you familiar with the identical provision in section 45, 24, 31, sub 45 of the Zoning Enabling Act?
I would have to go back and look at it. I don't have it in front of me right now.
Well, I'll represent to you that with respect to rear, it has the identical language. This is the state statute now. The lot line opposite and most distant from the front lot line, or in the case of triangular or otherwise irregularly shaped lots, an assumed line at least 10 feet in length entirely within the lot, parallel to and at a maximum distance from the front lot line. So,
Okay.
let's go back to your sewer bubble. Page 9. On lines 18 to 22. Is that right? The only reason to create this absurdly shaped subject parcel of land, as depicted, is to attempt to remove enough wetlands from the parcel in order to avoid having to address the requirements of the town zoning ordinance regarding the same, as well as to attempt to move the proposed parcel a few feet away from the delineated A80 line on the survey. Did I read that correctly, Mr. Raymond?
You did.
And then you say something similar in your supplemental advisory opinion. It's on page 10. I'll wait till everybody gets there. It's the bottom of the page. The paragraph that starts because the property falls within. Do you see that? And sort of in the middle of that paragraph you say, this was done presumably for the purpose of attempting to avoid implicating the aquifer overlay district and to exclude as much as practicable any wetlands. Correct?
Correct.
All right, let's clarify one thing first. How would someone determine the boundaries of any zoning district in Burrillville?
Boundaries of the zoning district?
Yes.
Talking about on the town zoning.
The town zoning map?
Correct.
Okay. And I know this was covered earlier, a little deeper. There's a specific provision on how someone would determine the boundaries of the A80 aquifer zone. Correct?
How to determine it?
Right. So you don't have to guess. Let's go to section 30-202 of the zoning ordinance. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we don't have to go to the zoning ordinance. It's actually in your supplemental advisory opinion, bottom of page 9. It's the paragraph numbered 1. Can you see that? I'm going to read this. designation. The aquifer zones and wellhead protection areas are herein established as overlay zones or districts, as shown on the aquifer overlay map of the town of Burrillville. Duplicated from the U.S. Geological Survey Water Resource Investigations 18-74 on the map number plate 1, close parade, and as most recently identified by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Office of Water Resources, as public water supply wellhead protection areas. So let me stop right there. This isn't just the town of Burrillville putting pins on a map. There's an aquifer zone here, correct? Said maps are hereby adopted by reference and are declared to be a part of this section. Said maps shall be on display at the office of the zoning enforcement officer, and again, that's you, right?
Correct.
Or available at the Rhode Island DEM, and shall include all land in the town denoted as overlaying saturated stratified drift or of any thickness and of any transmissivity, and shall identify all groundwater sources and aquifers. These overlay zones shall take precedence over any other zone use regulation overlaying them in this zoning chapter, unless otherwise mentioned. And that's all accurate, right?
Correct.
All right. Let's go back to the zoning ordinance for a moment. We're back in the definitions, section 30-3. I'll call out a page number in just a moment. I believe it's 272, but bear with me just a moment. I'm sorry, thank you, because Newton corrected me. It starts at 271. And it defines zoning map. And zoning map means the map or maps which are a part of the zoning chapter and which delineate the boundaries of all mapped zoning districts within the physical boundary of the town. Correct? I'm sorry, it was 279, I apologize. Put two lawyers together, they can't read the page now. All right. Did I read that correctly, Mr. Raymond?
You say means the map or maps which are a part of the zoning chapter which delineate the boundaries of all mapped zoning districts within the physical boundary of the town.
That's it. You got it. We put up the
Okay, we need to take a quick break.
Sure.
We'll be back in 10 minutes. Okay, ready?
I am manager. Thank you. Mr. Raymond, did you discuss your testimony with anyone here?
I did not.
Thank you, sir. All right, what we have up there, do you recognize that as the current official zoning map of the town of Burrillville? I'll represent to you. I did the same thing, got that straight off your website.
Okay. Again, the official zoning map under law is in the town clerk's office. We have a copy of it on the wall in my office.
Right.
That's the most current. The only changes that potentially could be there would be subdivision changes, not lot line, and not zoning district changes, so that certainly is accurate.
And I probably for the benefit of the board more than anybody else, because we haven't done this yet, might be a good idea to identify what the location is of this proposed facility. So if, Madam Chair, is it okay if I walk up there and just point to the screen?
You have to bring the microphone.
All right, I will. This is cumbersome. Oh, that's okay.
People can't hear you unless you're using it.
Right, understood, especially with the jackhammers in the background. So, what I'm pointing to over here, this blue area, that's the Wilson Reservoir, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and then if we start heading sort of west, thank you. You recognize this irregularly shaped lot here as Mr. Harris's lot?
Yes, it looks like it.
Okay.
It's in that area.
And then these are the residential lots along, this is 101 Walnut Lake Road.
Walnut Road.
Right. And then generally speaking, the area we're talking about for this facility is over here on the other side of Walnut Lake Road, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And if we could reduce this back down again, we know this is F5 because down here in the legend, F5 is what? Correct?
Correct.
Okay. We have another map up here now, Mr. Raymond. Do you recognize that one? And that one came from the website.
Yes.
And what is that?
That's the aquifer overlay zone map.
And the blue areas identify aquifer overlays?
Those are the different A80, A100, A120 districts.
Okay. Now, you've provided some testimony, and I think you also did this in response to Mr. Elmer's questions.
Excuse me, Mr. Blazer, could we blow that up like the other one and then you go point the 880 and the approximate area of the lot as well, so we can have that comparison?
Or you can ask the witness to finish that.
I'm here. Hopefully he'll agree with me. Go a little bit that way. You gotta come down with it. Reduce it a bit. A bit more. Alright. So, probably the best way to orient this, right, if you remember Mr. Raymond identified Mr. Harris's irregularly shaped lot over here. And here's Walnut Lake Road, correct, Mr. Raymond?
Correct.
And so the area would be generally over here, the area of our location, correct?
3 lots north of the
okay.
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, something.
This one. Sorry, why don't you go ahead and point them out? Probably should have done that to be.
It is portions of these 3 parcels. This one, and that one. This larger tract is where the Algonquin gas compressor station is.
Did that laid out for you, Ms. White?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. You testified, as I said, in response to Mr. Elmer's questions, and it's also in your supplemental advisory opinion, Exhibit 30, page 11. And this is where you talk about the process where there's a dispute about the aquifer overlay zone, correct?
Again, I didn't hear in the beginning, is this the rebuttal testimony?
Supplemental, I'm sorry. Supplemental advisory, page 11. Very top of the page.
Yes.
And you say, in fact, in a case such as the one presented here, where there is a question regarding whether a proposed project's land area is within the aquifer overlay district, there is a built-in procedure contained within section 30-202 to resolve the issue, as is stated in the ordinance, and then you quote the ordinance, right?
Correct.
So let's focus on what the ordinance says rather than what you said about it. Subsection 3, appeal of designation, where the bounds of the aquifer zones are in doubt or in dispute as delineated by the overlay map. And I want to stop there. Then there's a procedure for doing that, but that's where I want to stop. Where the bounds of the aquifer zones are in doubt or in dispute as delineated by the overlay map. You with me so far?
I'm with you.
Okay. Are you under the impression that Invenergy is disputing the bounds of the A80 zone?
No.
Are you under the impression that we're disputing what's on the town's official overlay map?
No.
What if there is no doubt or dispute about the bounds of the aquifer zone as delineated by the overlay map? Does,
There is doubt and there is a dispute.
in your mind?
In reality.
So, well, didn't I just ask you if you thought we dispute the bounds of the overlay zone, and you said, no, you agree that we don't?
You have never come to me and say that you dispute the bounds of the aquifer overlay. That's correct.
Okay. And what if we don't dispute where your map says the overlay zone is? Does 13202 apply?
Yes.
That's your interpretation?
Yes,
That even if we don't dispute where the zone is or where your map says the zone is, you think 13202 still applies?
I am saying that the bounds are in doubt.
The
And
bound-
you're saying that they are not, but I am saying that they are. It sounds to me like a dispute. It doesn't say if the applicant disputes this, it says when there is a dispute.
I get it, all right. I didn't understand what your statement was originally, so now I think I understand it.
Could I just interrupt for a minute? I'm sorry, Mr. Blazer, but I think you've been referring to 13-202, and it's actually 30. I just wanted the record to be clear.
I do. My brother, Mr. McElroy, is correct. It's 30-202. I do apologize. Now I understand it, Mr. McElroy. I think what you're saying is that you, Joe Raymond, dispute the bounds of the A80 overlay zone as depicted in the aquifer overlay map. Is that correct?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Is the creation of a lot, regardless of size and configuration, even if for the purpose of avoiding wetlands, prohibited by any law or regulation, as far as you know?
Not that I know.
There's no prohibition against that in the zoning ordinance, is there?
There's nothing in the zoning ordinance that says that, no.
Okay. And maybe you can help me out. Would you agree with me that the town wants us to minimize wetland impacts?
Yes.
That's fine. Let's go to a different topic. The facility rendering. You've probably seen a lot of versions of this. This is just one we happened to pick for today. But do you recognize this, Mr. Raymond, as a depiction of what this facility would look like when constructed?
That was pretty close to the one that we originally saw back in 2016.
All right. And you see the two stacks or chimneys that are sort of in the middle of the area where the main, what's called the power block is?
I do.
All right. Is it your position that Invenergy would need a dimensional variance with respect to those two chimneys that will be part of the facility?
No, it would not.
It would not.
It would not.
And that's because chimneys are exempt from the height limits in the F5 zone, correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Blazer, is the particular depiction that you have up from the application?
It's a demonstrative, Madam Chair. Ms. Verdi, the leader of the pack, can probably answer that question better than I can.
It's a blown-up version of the image that's on the cover of Invenergy 1C-1.
Sorry, just have a moment. I'm sure I'm carving out things that I would like to ask. Let's go back to the general subject of your position that we haven't submitted after the plans. Okay, just general terminology so we know what subject we're talking about, okay?
Okay.
All right. Let's go to your advisory opinion, Exhibit 29, page 3. You're there.
Advisory opinion, page 3, I'm on.
All right. Roughly the middle of the page when you say, to date, I have not received anything from Invenergy in the form of plans, narratives, or construction drawings to meet any of the requirements of the Town of Burrillville's soil erosion and sediment control ordinance. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
And then on page 4, based on the information available to me at this time, I can make no recommendation to the Energy Facility Siting Board in regards to the request under the first advisory opinion. I'll stop there for now. Did I read that correctly?
There's 2 or 3 bases here, so which paragraph are you?
Based on the information available to me at this time.
Is that at the start of the paragraph?
It's in the recommendations paragraph, right about in the middle.
It's the 7th line down, Mr. Ray.
I've got it.
Okay. And when now this was in September of 2016, is it this advisory opinion, correct?
It's correct.
And when Mr. McElroy questioned you this morning, you remember he asked you if you had any changes to your pre-filed testimony, you remember that?
Yes, I did.
And you said you didn't, right?
Correct.
So you stand by what I just read to you as of today?
As of today, 2018, or as of today, when this was written?
As of today.
Well, that's not, I object. When we ask people if they have changes or corrections in their testimony, it's not to bring it up to date since something that was filed a year ago. That would require a supplemental filing. We ask whether you found any typographical errors or calculation errors or something like that in a review of your testimony. That question does not mean has anything changed since the time you filed your testimony. And that's our usual practice.
Madam Chair, I'm fully aware of that. I'm asking if his opinion has changed as of today. That's all.
As of today,
Okay, but you did refer to Mr. McElroy asking whether anything had changed since then.
I apologize for the confusion, Madam Chair.
As of today, July 2018, that has changed.
Thank you.
This is 2 years ago.
Let's go to your Surrey bubble. It's Town Exhibit 19. I'm on page 10, Mr. And that was, your Surrey bundle was filed September 27th of last year, correct?
It was in September.
A couple of statements here on page 10, line 14 to 22. I won't read all of it, but at one point, it's actually at the top of page 11, you say that you take affront of Mr. Pimentel's statement that what I have been requesting from Invenergy is unlawful. You see that?
Yes.
Let's go to the...
What are you going to now? Couldn't hear that.
I'm sorry, it's another exhibit.
Okay, what exhibit?
It doesn't have a number yet, it's
Oh.
not.
Mr. Blazer, so is this something we have not seen before?
You've seen it before, it's in the record.
Okay.
It's just not an exhibit in this hearing yet. Yes. Yes. You want to put that record down and we'll do that? So, we've just worked out with Ms. Corelli that some of these things that aren't yet marked as exhibits, we'll mark them as exhibits for identification and their admission later to the extent necessary.
Could you also identify then where that language that you quoted was?
The I take a front language. That was surrebuttal, which is Exhibit 19, is the top of page 11, lines 1 to 2. Actually, lines 1 to 3, Madam Chair.
Sorry, I couldn't find it because you said it was at page 10 at lines 14 to 23.
My apologies. All right. So what we've, may I proceed, Madam Chair? Thank you. What we've handed out is Invenergy Exhibit 156 for identification. That is a letter from Mr. Shore at Adler, Pollock and Sheehan to Mr. McElroy. You see that dated June 9, 2017. See that? Mr. Raymond?
I do see it.
Okay. And if you could go to page 3 of that letter, at the very bottom, Mr. Shore said to Mr. McElroy, "Finally, I repeat my request made to you in my email of May 22, 2017, that Invenergy would like to meet with the building inspector to answer questions and to further assist the building inspector to ensure he has what is needed in order to prepare his supplemental advisory opinion. I have not heard back from you on this request, and so I follow up again here." Did I read that correctly?
No, that's what it says.
And you refused that request to me, is that correct?
I refused it to you personally?
No, not to me. You refused to meet with Invenergy's representatives, didn't you?
I'm sorry, I thought you said I refused it to you.
No, sir. To meet.
To meet.
Yes.
I did not meet with Invenergy, no.
The next one.
Have we marked it for ID? That, was it marked for ID?
We marked it for ID 156.
156.
Yes, but I don't know if everything is that small, that's why we
We'll move it as full.
I have no objection.
It's 156 or 56?
156. So it would be energy 156.
Yes.
No one had objections to?
I had none.
No objection.
Okay, then that's full.
Do you intend to mark all of these as well? That's all.
This next one, I will also, yes. Do you have that one? Exhibit 157, Mr. Raymond?
I have it right here, yes.
And for the record, that is Mr. McElroy's June 30, 2017 response to the letter from Mr. Shore, correct?
Correct.
And again, let's go to the last page. And Mr. McElroy said to Mr. Shore, "Finally, we do not believe it would be productive to meet with Invenergy. When it is apparent that there has been no serious attempt to address the following," and he lists a number of things. And in fact, that meeting never took place, correct?
Correct.
Instead, rather than the meeting, I assume you're aware that Mr. McElroy filed a motion to dismiss this proceeding. You're aware of that?
definitely remember a motion to dismiss this.
And you recall
There may have
that,
been more than one,
I apologize.
so I can't tell you which one we're talking about.
Let me see if I can refresh you a little bit. This is the one where Mr. McElroy argued Invenergy has failed to provide complete plans as to all structures associated with the proposed facility. Is that
I'm
one?
familiar with that.
You are
yes.
familiar with that one? Yes. And I assume you're aware that the board denied that motion?
Yes.
I'm going to read you something from their finding, and I'm going to ask you a question about it. This is from, I don't know if we need this as an exhibit, Patty. It's the October 18, 2017 board order denying the motion to dismiss.
That's the one order designed.
Thank you. The board found that the information provided in the application, as well as that which was provided to the Burrillville inspector, constitutes complete plans as intended by the Act and the rules. In addition to the numerous drawings provided by Invenergy, the application, responses to data requests, and other filings provided by Invenergy, the application, and other filings include detailed written descriptions which the board found support and supplement the extensive drawings. The board found that all of this information, the conceptual drawings as well as the written descriptions, contains a sufficient level of detail as was intended by the Act and the rules, and thus constitutes complete plans. Prior board precedent in the Ocean State Power matter, setting the stage for the creation of a post-licensure proceeding, supports the board's conclusions that fully detailed final drawings are not necessary to render an application complete. Mr. Raymond, do you disagree with the board's finding?
I don't disagree with the last sentence you just read there. I don't think anybody has ever asked Invenergy for plans 100% complete, ready for construction plans. And I believe the request by Attorney McElroy is pretty specific about that also.
So then, would it be correct that you agree with the board's finding?
I don't have, the board has spoken, and there's nothing more that I can say about that.
Intelligent mind.
Was the board ruling on whether it was sufficient under the Act or for the zoning officials?
Under
in
the Act.
town?
Under the Act, Madam Chair. I'm just wondering if he disagrees. Or agrees.
That's been asked and answered twice already.
I don't believe he answered the question. My last question was...
We could have the stenographer read back the respective answers.
Actually, I probably should ask that. I thought this was Mr. McElroy's witness. I'm not quite sure why Mr. Elmer is objecting, but nevertheless, I have no objection to the court reporter reading back my last question and seeing if Mr. Raymond did in fact answer it.
So then would it be correct that you agree with the board's finding? In other words, I don't have, the board has spoken, there's nothing more that I can say about that.
Okay, Madam Chair, my question is, does he agree or disagree?
I think that was an answer, Madam Chair.
All right, you can ask for a yes or no.
Mr. Raymond, agree or disagree?
That's not a yes or no question.
I'm sorry. Do you agree? Yes or? He's absolutely right. He got me. Do you agree? Yes or no?
In part, yes, and in part, no.
Which part do you disagree with?
I disagree that the complete plans as defined in the general law were submitted by Invenergy.
Let's switch to a different subject. I'm going to read you a description of this facility. The proposed facility, singular, will be configured as a 2-unit, one-on-one, duct-fired combined cycle generation station. Again, singular.
Could I ask what he's reading?
From my notes.
Okay.
You disagree with that description, is that right?
I disagree that this is one energy generating facility.
It's your position that a use variance is required because the Clear River facility will have 2 turbines, is that correct?
They have multiple energy generating turbines. I'm not really big on the language for power plant constructions. It is clear to me that there are 2 standalone power plants here.
So it's your position that because the facility will have 2 turbines, it's actually 2 facilities, plural.
Correct.
And it seems like ages ago at this point, but we discussed that the zoning ordinance defines an electric generating facility as any generating facility designed to generate electric energy in excess of 180 megawatts annually, right?
Correct.
Could you go back to the definitions of the zoning ordinance on page 274? It's the definitions that define dwellings. See where I'm at?
Yes.
All right, so we have dwelling, single family, means a structure containing 1 dwelling unit or household and no other principal use, correct?
Correct.
Dwelling, 2 family, means 2 single dwelling units or households, each with separate entrances divided by a common party wall or floor, correct?
Correct.
Dwelling, multifamily, means a residential building designed for or occupied by 3 households or more, with the number of families and residents not to exceed the number of dwelling units provided, correct?
Correct.
And 3 or more, that the more could be theoretically any number, right? More could be 10, 20, right?
Yes.
Where in the ordinance do I find the language that says an electric generating facility can only have 1 turbine?
Doesn't say that. If I may, definition of electric generating facility.
There's no question pending, Madam Chair. For the record, Madam Chair, we'll call this one Invenergy 158.
Can I bring hard copies of the next hearing tape?
If you look up at the TV there, Mr. Raymond, do you recognize what that is?
It's like Ocean State Power.
It is,
Yes.
as a matter of fact. I'll represent that to you. And you're aware that Ocean State Power has 4 turbines?
I'm not aware of how many turbines they have.
Well, I'll represent to you, since the day it was built and began operating, it has 4 turbines.
Since the
So,
day it was built. actually two property owners, two facilities at one time.
Again, I'll represent to you that it has 4 turbines. You'll see the structures to the lower part before the cooling area. You see 4 structures there, 2 on each side?
I do see.
Okay, those are 4 turbines. Take my word for it. So, if you'll accept for my word that that facility has 4 turbines in the town of Burrillville, is that 1 electric generating facility or 4?
My position would still be there are 4 facilities there.
And was that one permitted as 4 separate electric generating facilities?
I don't know. I know there were 2 different plants there, but I don't know enough about it to tell you. I wasn't involved in town government in those days.
Have you ever issued a notice of violation to Ocean State Power or whoever owns it today, claiming that they're in violation of the zoning ordinance?
No, I have not.
I want to go back for a moment to the description that I started this line of questioning with, which is the proposed facility will be configured as a 2-unit, 1-on-1 duct-fired combined cycle generation station. You recall we started with that description?
Yes.
And that's the one you disagree with?
It's one of the multiple ones that I listed in I believe it was in the rebuttal. It may have been in one of the advisory opinions.
But you disagree with that description?
Disagree with the description?
That it's the proposed facility, singular, will be configured as a 2-unit, 1-on-1 duct-fired combined cycle generation station, singular.
Position is that any electric generating facility is any facility designed to generate electric energy in excess of 180 megawatts. Therefore, if there are 2 units separate doing that, there are 2 electric generating facilities on that site.
Have you ever told Glenn Walker that you disagree with his description of this project as a single facility?
To be honest, I'm not sure I've met Mr. Walker.
Did you ever tell Ms. Mocker, who was the former assessor in Burrillville, who adopted Mr. Walker's report as the formal assessor's opinion that was submitted in this case, that you disagree with that description of this being a single facility?
I've never spoken to Ms. Meeker in regards to that.
Right. Did you ever tell the town council, since they agree with and adopted the assessor's advisory opinion, that you disagree with that description?
I've never spoken to town council about this, no.
Briefly on survey, with respect to Mr. Lipsitz, you have acknowledged that you're not questioning the quality of his work on this project as a professional land surveyor, correct?
That's correct.
This is from your surrebuttal, pages 16 to 17. Bottom of the page, starting at line 20 at the bottom of page 16. The main thing I take issue with is his implication that the parcel now being sought to be the site for the CREC has long been identified in a specific plan and that there will be no problem with intrusion into wetlands and the aquifer. And you still stand by that statement?
I do.
If I may have a moment, Madam Chair. That's all I have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We don't have the hard copy yet, but we'll move 157, which is the
I
oldest.
actually found it.
Oh, you did find it?
Yeah,
Well, we do
sorry.
have hard copies. I'm sorry, we'll move 157, which is Mr. McElroy's letter, and then 158 will be the OSP area.
No objection.
CLF has no objection.
No objection.
And then after the break, we'll catch up on numbering the ones we did earlier.
Okay, so that's 157 and 158. Oh,
Correct.
And Madam Chairperson, I don't want to stand between folks at lunch, but at the appropriate time, I do have some follow-up questions for this.
yes, I think there are more questions. But I think now we will break for lunch.
All I would ask, Madam Chair, is that you instruct the witness not to discuss his testimony with anyone during the break.
Please don't discuss your testimony, Mr. Mayor, during the break. Okay, back on the record. And first, I've been advised that there is no objection to the maps, well, 2 maps and a picture of a power plant. Those are Invenergy exhibits 158, 160, and 161, and they're admitted both. Yes, for people following along chronologically.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
159 is marked for ID only.
And Madam Chair, my understanding is that the zoning ordinance doesn't need to be marked because you can take administrative notice of it.
Yeah, that's administrative notice of the zoning ordinance. Yes. No. Where?
That's
May I proceed, Madam Chair? Thank you. Mr. Raymond, you bring out, please, Burrillville Exhibit 30, which is your supplemental advisory opinion, and turn to page 7.
Yes.
Paragraph 3, line 4. This morning, I asked you, I read part of a sentence that said, starting at line 4, the planning board has not been provided with enough information to adequately evaluate the project for compliance with local laws and processes. And I asked you this morning whether that was still your opinion, and you said yes. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And I then asked you whether in your, how frequent it is in your professional experience that the planning board would not be provided sufficient information by an applicant. And you said it was fairly rare, and then the planning board would require additional information. Do you recall that?
Correct. Although, I think we talked a little bit about zoning boards at that point when I mentioned that, but the same thing would be true with the planning board.
Yes, and then Mr. Blazer asked you this morning about some advisory opinions that have been filed in this case. And I'd like to ask you, do you take the position today that the planning board has not been provided with enough information to adequately evaluate the project for compliance with local laws and processes, even though DEM has provided an advisory opinion in the case?
Yes.
And do you take that position even though DEM has provided a supplementary advisory opinion?
Yes, I do.
And you take that position despite the fact that the Department of Health has submitted an advisory opinion?
Yes.
You take that position despite the fact that there has been an advisory opinion from the Department of Transportation?
Yes.
Were you even aware of the fact that one of the issues addressed by the Public Utilities Commission in its advisory opinion would be the rate impacts of this plant for the 6 New England states within the footprint of ISO New England?
I'm not aware of that, no.
If you did know that, would that change your opinion here on page 7, paragraph 3, that the planning board has not been provided with enough information to adequately evaluate the project for compliance with local laws and processes?
That wouldn't change my opinion, no.
And at the bottom of page 7, this morning, I directed you to the last paragraph where you said, "It has been almost a year since I noted that Invenergy failed to submit the proper requests for relief from the Burrillville Zoning Board in their application." And I asked you whether that is still your opinion today. And you said yes. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And then I asked you, in your professional experience, how common it is that an applicant would fail to submit proper requests for relief. And you said fairly rare. Do you recall that?
I did, yes.
Would your opinion about that change in light of the fact that DEM submitted an advisory opinion in this case?
No.
Would your opinion change if you knew that DEM submitted a supplemental advisory opinion in this case?
No, it would not.
Does the PUC advisory opinion change your view?
No.
How about the Department of Health advisory opinion? Does that change your view today?
No, it doesn't.
Page 17 of your supplemental advisory opinion. First paragraph, you say, "It is clear 2 years into the public portion of this process that the choice of a site for the Clear River Energy Center from a planning and zoning perspective alone was poorly thought out." Do you hold that opinion today as well?
I do.
Even though DEM filed an advisory opinion?
Yes.
Even though DOH filed an advisory opinion?
Yes.
Does the PUC advisory opinion change your view?
No, it does not.
This morning, Mr. Blazer asked you a number of questions that you answered. Were your answers to Mr. Blazer truthful?
Yes, they were.
And when you were answering him, did you consult with a lawyer named Doherty before you answered Mr. Blazer?
No.
Did you consult with Mr. McElroy before you answered?
No.
Did you consult with any lawyer in the world before you answered?
No.
Are your advisory opinions a fair and honest reflection of your views?
Definitely.
Page 8 of your supplemental advisory opinion. In the middle of the page, in boldface text, you say the applicant requires a use variance to construct the creek because this use is not allowed in an aquifer A80 overlay zone. Do you see that?
Yes.
Sitting here today, do you believe that there is a disagreement between the Town of Burrillville and Invenergy as to whether that statement on page 8 is correct?
Yes, there's definitely a disagreement.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Is this a good time for us to ask our question, Madam Chair? Okay. Yeah, I may have some more. I guess my first question would be to you, Mr. Blazer, and I can put it in the form of a data request if that's more appropriate. There has been a lot of talk about the jigsaw piece or the survey lines for the lot. Is that June 17 plan the last plan in terms of the configuration of that lot? And if you...
It is.
Okay.
It is.
Okay, thanks. A couple questions, please. I can be specific or general. What I'm trying to get, you made clear that you think a hydrogeologic expert is needed. And you requested, I think, in response to questions, that that be something that the board required. You also made clear that you need more information about wetlands in terms of the 40% zoning ordinance. In terms of the soil erosion and sediment control plan or other things that you would be lacking or think that you think we need, can you list those?
The way I had mentioned in my advisory opinion, the first advisory opinion was I didn't have the information, so it was lacking. The second one, there is information there, and I'm not going to suggest, especially when you break it down to those second levels of the soil erosion sediment control plan, etc. But a lot of this is all based upon identifying where the wetlands are because of the nature of the soil erosion plan. So I'm kind of waiting for that to be approved in the same manner as I've been. But to get that, I'm waiting for the fact that DEM has made an approval of wetland, approved the wetland flagging for this property, for the site, and then the determination as to what is the percentage of wetlands and jurisdiction of wetlands on the property. I mean, if the question is, or if someone were to ask me and say, well, what if we tell you that there will be no more than 25%? That's fine, but I don't know that.
I think the point you're making is the wetlands permit from DEM is different from your zoning ordinance. And I think, and again, I can make this a data request to the town because there's a lot that's covered, but knowing what are the pieces of information still needed to comply with the town zoning ordinance is what I'm trying to get at. So you gave me wetlands, you need to see the wetlands delineation to know whether or not that 40% is triggered.
There's things we were talking about were more along the line of the planning board applications.
Okay.
And we'll get that information from the town planner as to where things stand there. His position is that not enough
We'd be happy to accept that as a record request.
Okay. I think that's a good way to go. Since we were looking a lot at this municipal ordinance, I just wanted to refer back to it. Make sure I got the pages. We covered a lot of the ground. So on page 280 that was referred to are the different, the 10 zoning districts. And then on page 292 was the table that Mr. Blazer took you through about different uses. So let's just go to 292. And my question for you is, why do you think that A80, one of the 10 zoning districts, is not included on this table of uses?
A80 and A120 are zoning districts. They're overlay districts, so they appear within other zoning districts. I'm not sure there would be a reason to have two sets of standards for each zoning district. One that's general, saying these are the things you can do in that district, and two, adding 3 more lines to this and potentially make a mistake, and on one of them say, yes, that's supposed to be a special use or not.
Right.
That's the only reason I can think it's sort of redundant.
Okay. And because the A80 can overlay several of the other districts.
Correct. And it does. It pretty much overlays the A80, A108, 120, pretty much overlays. I'm going to say it overlays all.
Okay, that's helpful. And then let's just flip to A80, because I think, so, this is so many places, but maybe it was better to go to your supplemental page. Let's go to your supplemental AO 9 and 10. I think it's helpful to define what transmissivity means. Can you just give a general definition of that?
I don't have the definition here, but I can explain it along the lines of water travels underground, and the nature of the subsurface allows more of it to form or settle in certain areas. This project was undertaken to determine where the future potential water supplies in the Branch River Basin or the northwest corner of the state existed. And when you start getting into the gravelly, grainy, stratified layers, they're larger with more space, more water will fit inside those areas. And when you get to smaller ones like ledge, rock, even at some point, water will probably travel through everything to some degree. And this is the way it was explained to me, which makes sense to me along that line too. Areas where water cannot pass as easily, there is less of a chance that any kind of contamination occurrence to happen, whereas one where you have a very large layer of stratified, hence the situations that you would find in the Superfund site, for example, where people dump things and the water just through rainwater or other liquid flow that brings you down into the lower level of the system, those become there's more danger of contamination. So the larger the number for the transmissivity, the A120, the ones you're going to find the closest to the river and the recharge areas. The lower ones, the A80, would be more where there are layers from geologic times where this remains, and they can now be utilizing those areas for potable water in the future or now.
In the map that you have in your aquifer overlay map, what year is that from, do you know?
This one that's being sent around right now?
Yeah.
The aquifer overlay map is the actual map was drawn in late 1960s, and it is the study map that was created by these two hydrogeologists, Raymond. Terrible to say that man has passed away, and I've worked with him.
It's in your...
But that map was, to incorporate this, was superimposed onto, again, this was the time when this was first done, was 30 years ago. We did not have the technology that it is today. However, the bottom line in the end is if there's an argument over the aquifer overlay map drawn by a vendor to put on a GIS map, or the Dickerman map. Obviously, the map that was created to demonstrate this area in the first place from the 1970s is the map that supersedes.
And I won't beat a dead horse. I think your point is because the water, I wanted you to talk about transmissivity because the water moves in an aquifer on different strata, and you want a clearer picture of where the aquifer is. Is that the reason that you want to have the hydrogeologic wells?
The layers, the strata that can be contaminated easier would be ones that have more transmissivity, so more water could go through them. So that's identifying that area. Again, they make reference in their study and they make reference on the map that more, basically it doesn't specifically say exactly where it is, but it says it's not accurate and further study needs to, further drilling is the word they use for it, needs to be done to determine the limit of the districts in a specific area.
Thanks, I understand. I also wanted back to the lot. Your testimony says, and that was in the rebuttal testimony, that, well, two things. One, in questioning for Mr. Blazer, you said when he was looking for it in the zoning, you said this isn't in the zoning, it's in the subdivision regs. When he was talking about whether or not there was a prohibition against an irregular lot, you said in your testimony today. So is there, I'm just trying to get at, is there a provision in the subdivision regs that? There is. And what is that? And what does it say?
I don't have it in front of me, and that's why I'm saying that information like that would be best addressed to the town planner.
I'd take that as a record.
Okay, please. You also said, and this may be a question for Mr. Blazer, but you said that you did not know whether Algonquin and Invenergy have agreed to the new lot lines. That was in your testimony. Do you know now whether they've agreed?
I believe that we'll see that when there's a transfer of property, but I've never been given any information one way or another.
I would just point out, Director Coyle, if I may, Spectra had to sign the application.
Okay.
The property owner did, so I can assume the answer to that.
Good, thank you.
I should, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just for the sake of the record.
I'm sorry, they what? Spectra what? Or Algonquin?
They had to sign the applications that we submitted to the town as property owner. Invenergy was the applicant, and Spectra was the property owner, and it's required that we have the property owner sign. It's standard.
And I just wanted to point out, Director Coyle, the map, the aquifer overlay map that's in the record now is Exhibit 161, is dated effective 3/22/06.
Thank you.
Is that any different than 1960?
If you have some questions, you could go forward because I want to just look at my notes a little bit more while you're doing that.
All right, I've got a couple. So I'm going to take us back to the zoning bylaw again, with apologies to everybody for flipping into that document, but we already walked through, and I'm trying to keep my place in about 3 documents at the same time. I'm sure you can all appreciate that. We're going to page 310, and we had already walked through a bit of what the requirements were for the lot dimensions for F5, but I was curious, we had skipped the last one, which was the structure, the height of the maximum height of the structure, and I just wanted to run through those quickly and ask you a question. So for a main structure, which I assume in this case, well, maybe I shouldn't assume, but of the buildings that are potentially being proposed for the property, would they primarily be considered main structures?
That I'm not sure.
Microphone, Joe, microphone.
There you go. I moved it. Sorry.
That I'm not sure. The applicant submitted a list of all the principal and accessory structures incorporated in this 50 some odd structures, and they only put one principal structure, and that's the administration building. I'm not sure why, but that's the way that they put it.
So from what I'm reading here, it looks like the maximum height of structures is 50 feet for an
It says
S5.
main here, but the term basically is principal, and
Okay.
then 25 feet for an accessory structure.
And there is a footnote on this, which I have not flipped to. It's footnote number 2 at the end of the table. If you'll
That
bear with me.
relates to industrial and commercial sites, so it probably is not going to be pertinent to this property, which is in a residential district.
But I
Oh,
think
no, that's the
was-
one where it mentions the spires, chimneys, towers, monuments, flagpoles.
So that would actually account for your prior answer that the chimneys would not.
Correct.
Okay. Just wanted to see where that actually sat in terms of what the dimensional requirements were. Another question, this is back to a little bit about what Director Quick was just talking about. In terms of the lot shapes, my understanding is from someone's testimony earlier today, and you'll forgive me, I believe that it was when we were dealing with the survey issue and speaking with Mr. Lipsitz, we were talking about the number of lots that exist currently versus the number of lots that are being created going forward. My understanding is right now there are more non-conforming lots than would be created. Is that also your understanding?
Yes, there's been zoning in Burrillville since 1961, and the F5 district was only created in 1982. So any lot in the farming district, which is still substantially, which was in 61 the F district, broken down to F2 and F5 in 1982. Any pre-existing lot in those areas would be allowed to continue. Would not have, that wouldn't change going forward. It's no different than the Algonquin site. The compressor station actually has been there prior to zoning. At least the piping for it. I'm not sure the whole station, but the piping going through is done in the late 1950s. So.
I'm curious because very often the requirement is that there should be, if it's less non-conforming. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is that it will be less non-conforming than the current configuration. That's going to be subjective as well, obviously.
I don't think there's a disagreement between Invenergy and the town, meaning me as a zoning official here, that there is the ability to create a 5-acre parcel or larger in an F5 district. The issue brought up about the shape of the lot, etc., is that if somebody were to come to the town and request to create a lot of this size and shape, in most cases, other than a pre-existing lot, the town would not allow that because of the shape, of the structure, and they have certain standards for that. Now, there are times when they might do it, in which case, in planning, they would grant waivers for that instead of a variance like the zoning board. But I'm the wrong person to ask the question specifically as to what would be required for this particular lot. That I'm assuming now I'm dealing with the lot that was submitted, the last one that was submitted with the meets and bounds description, which is different than the one before it, the ones previous to that.
Thank you.
So you're saying ask the town's witness from the planning board about the subdivision regulation? Is that what your advice is? Okay.
My advice would be to talk to the town planner.
Okay.
get the town planner involved, because this is what they do every day.
And again, we would volunteer any record requests, we would run them by the town planner, have him answer them and submit them. If you'd like to have us bring him in, we're happy to do that.
Okay. I think I asked this earlier in a very general way, but I just wanted to ask you one more time about the soil erosion sediment control plan. And just, and I believe that you answered it, but that is a local requirement separate from the state requirement, and it's something that you're still lacking information that you need to review the SESC plan.
I think the soil erosion sediment control plan, the language is very similar, if not exact in most places, to the state plan.
But it's approved by the town.
It's
That's a question.
portions. It's complicated, which
Yeah,
I think you
yeah,
know more
yeah.
about it than I
Yeah.
do, to be honest with you. But for example, when does it trigger a Army Corps of Engineer review? When does it, up to 1 acre, it's created a certain way. 1 to 5 acres, it's treated differently. There's certain things. In the end, in essence, my role in this is administrator to make sure that everything is done.
Okay.
I'm not the scientist
Yeah.
that decides it's done.
Okay, good enough. I do not think I have more questions.
Are there other questions? You're right.
I have a few, yes. Thank you. Mr. Raymond, do you have Invenergy 157, which is the June 30th, 2017 budget?
If it helps move things along, I can share my copy with you.
Or we could put it up on the screen. It's the Invenergy 157.
There we are.
Yes, and that's the right page, thank you. It's up on the screen. Mr. Raymond, on that page, says on the last page of that letter, if you want to turn to it because it's highlighted,
Yes.
you were directed to one sentence in there which says, finally, we do not believe it would be productive to meet with Invenergy when it is apparent that there has been no serious attempt to address the following. And your attention was drawn to that by Invenergy's attorney. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Right. But your Invenergy's attorney did not read the following bulleted points. And I'd like to look at them and go over them with you. The first bullet point says, a detailed description of the proposed facility, including its function and operating characteristics, and complete plans as to all structures, including, where applicable, underground construction, transmission facilities, cooling systems, pollution control systems, and fuel storage facilities associated with the proposed location for the project. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Did I call you before I wrote this letter and ask you to tell me what it is that you needed?
Yes.
And is this one of the things that you said you needed?
This was one of the things that I requested, yes.
And in fact, is the language in this first bullet point an exact quote from the Energy Facility Siting Board Rule 1.6B4? To the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. The second bullet was you told me you needed a survey of the proposed lot meeting the standards of a subdivision plan to create a lot that the CREC is projected to be constructed on. Did you ask me to try to get that?
I did ask you for that, yes.
At the time we wrote this letter, did you have that?
No.
What did you have? What was wrong?
We had a plan that showed approximately where on the property this lot existed, with no meets and bounds description, so it was very hard. We're being put in a position to guess where it belongs.
All right, thank you. The third bullet you were looking for Issues the building inspector addressed in his advisory opinion of September 2016 regarding the use variances required and potentially required once he is capable of reviewing the actual lot for the CREC to determine what issues need to be addressed. And did you ask me for that? To try to get that?
I did, yes.
And the final bullet was a response from Invenergy regarding the building inspector's zoning determinations. Again, there had been no response regarding that.
It was not, no.
So when we talked about whether or not it was appropriate or would be productive to have a meeting, we talked about, well, a meeting would be fine, but not until we get this information, right?
That's correct.
Now, one of the things you mentioned with regard to relief that might be required is that no relief was required for the chimneys because there's a specific exception for that, correct?
Correct.
But you have seen a submission from Invenergy that shows over 50 structures on this particular lot, correct?
That's correct.
And am I correct that a number of those structures will need height relief?
Yes.
Do you remember when Mr. Blazer asked you and directed your attention to your surrebuttal testimony where you mentioned that you take affront to Mr. Pimentel's statement that what you have been requesting from Invenergy is unlawful? Do you recall that? It's on page 11 at the top of that testimony. Do you recall that? Do you have it in front of you? It's your supplemental testimony?
No.
I'm sorry, surrebuttal, I apologize. It's your surrebuttal testimony.
I have it here, yes.
And it's the top of page 11. First line at the end.
Yes.
And you were directed to the phrase, or the sentence, I take affront from Mr. Pimentel's statement that what I've been requesting from Invenergy is unlawful. Correct?
Correct.
Mr. Blazer did not direct you to the explanation prior to that, which begins at the bottom of page 10. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to read it into the record and tell me if this is why you took affront. Beginning at the bottom of page 10, about 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom, it states, again, as has been stated numerous times, a parcel of land needs to be identified first, and only then can the site-related issues be reviewed. This identification and approval of this site must be done prior to obtaining any other permits or approvals. To suggest otherwise is ludicrous and would render any review in the absence of such identification fraught with potential error and meaningless. For these reasons alone, it is clear why identifying a specific finite parcel from the beginning of a permitting and review process is critical. To suggest that what information I have been requesting from Invenergy, whether it is identification of a parcel for the site or plans for the project, is not necessary to properly review this project is clearly false. End the quote. Is that why you were taking affront to Mr. Pimentel's statement?
Yes.
You discussed with Mr. Blazer the issue of your feeling that because this facility consists of 2 independent turbines that can run independently of each other, you feel that it's actually 2 facilities and it therefore needs a use variance, correct?
That's correct.
Can you give me some examples as to why you feel that these are 2 separate facilities?
In my surrebuttal, I made suggestions just how logically it would be following, putting as many I'm sorry, what are they calling it, generators, as many generators and creating as much electricity on one site and call it a facility, therefore means the nature of this is the plurality of this thing is not an issue in even just understanding what you're proposing to do, because you could have 50 there if you had enough room for it, and it just doesn't follow logically, and I can't rationalize that. I would take the more simplest way of looking at it as term facility is a singular term. There's a plural word for it, facilities. And if it was meant to be utilized that way, I would think it would have been put that way.
All right, well, let me ask you some questions. You've reviewed the plans that have been submitted so far, correct?
I have.
All right. And there's a Unit 1 and there's a Unit 2? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Each has its own separate turbine?
Yes,
Each can operate independently of the other, correct?
that's correct.
Each has been bid separately into the ISO auction?
I will agree with that. I'm not aware of how that works, but I would say yes.
The construction is expected to be phased, with Unit 1 being built first, then followed by Unit 2, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
In fact, the plan is to build Unit 1 and turn it on as soon as they can, even though Unit 2 is not done yet, correct?
That's correct.
They've made commitments regarding how many days, for example, they will be operating Unit 1 and or Unit 2 on oil, for example, correct?
That's correct.
And those restrictions apply independently to each separate unit, correct?
That's correct. My understanding is it can be used for either unit. It doesn't have to be specific to one or the other.
I'm going to go over, for just a few more minutes, the question of how the overlay ordinance works and the procedure that's set forth in there for resolving any issues of when the actual location of the aquifer is in doubt. And I'd like to follow up on Director Coit's questioning in that regard. She asked you to define transmissivity. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And basically your discussion with her was very technical and was over my head, but as I think she mentioned, basically water moves, correct?
Correct.
And when did you say this this original mapping was done for the overlay? Did you say 30 years ago or more?
More than that. I believe the number, the date on the map is 1972 or 1974.
All right. And the actual map itself that says that it was adopted by the town council is in 2006 is not when it was created. It was created, as you said, in the 70s.
That's correct. It was adopted by the town in the 1980s, 1987, 1988. I'm not that accurate on it, but it's in the late 1980s.
Right. Well, it does say on Exhibit 161 that it was adopted by the town council on 3/22/06. So whether it was readopted, I don't know.
I assume that would be a readoption because the way that the zoning ordinance, to keep a map current under the state requirements, the official town map for the town is required to be in the hands of the town clerk. Because we can now do, with technology, make changes on a map without having to go to a company and have it all done again. We had come up with a system back in the early 2000s that when there is a change and we have to demonstrate it on the map, a new map would be created only changing the area that had just been changed through council approval. Then it would be resubmitted to the town council through the clerk's office so that they could recognize, receive, and file it, and it would stay in the office of the town clerk.
But I guess what
So
I'm
that
looking,
must have been done at that time.
okay, what I'm looking for is, do you know if there has been, if there was any study work that was done to determine whether or not the boundaries of the aquifer overlay zone had changed since the 70s?
The only study work that I am familiar with that never was completed was for a project that was going to be done in the village of Glendale that in the end was stopped, so it didn't, we never got to the actual drilling.
So they never actually did any drilling?
No.
So to the best of your knowledge, the outline of the overlay zone set forth in Exhibit 161 has remained the same since the 70s?
Correct.
And do you have some concerns? I mean, what exactly is your concern? Why do you feel that the exact boundaries are in doubt?
The authors of the study and who created the map have doubt, and they put it in their language, in their study, and they actually put it on the map, that if there's a question as to where something is, again, they were starting from the opposite of all this. They were looking for the most water.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I have to object. We're now talking about something that was put on a map that's certainly not in this record.
Excuse me, before you get any further, you can look at page 12 of the rebuttal testimony, Exhibit 19.
I understand, Director Coit. I'm talking about, he's talking about a map that is not in this record.
I think he's talking about the narrative that's on the map, and that's what's on page 12.
I think that's correct.
So may he continue?
Yes.
This map is the basis for our aquifer overlay districts.
And because water moves, it's possible that the boundaries that are shown on this map may not be accurate anymore?
The boundaries on the map were not specifically accurate at that time, and that's the real question that's going on here at this point. It's the water moves, but the layers of stratified drift would change in a much slower rate. Again, I'm not a geologist, but I think they would be quick to say that the underground geology doesn't change quickly.
And we know, because Mr. Lipsitz conceded this morning, that the large lot out of which the smaller lot is being carved is definitely in the A80 overlay district, correct?
We know that the southerly portion of the Algonquin property is in the A80 district. Yes.
And could you tell me why it's important to protect the aquifer?
In our community, we have all our water is supplied by wells. We do have 2 water companies, but both of which supply their water through drilled wells and dug wells, and not from the reservoir. It's been a concern in the town all these years, and I believe well, the reason that it came up at one point in our history was not soon after there was a rather large Superfund issue between Burrillville and North Smithfield back in the early to mid-1980s. And this was a response by the town to identify where are our problem areas and where can we limit development in those areas.
And so the method that was used in these overlay districts for the aquifer is to limit the things that can be done in the land above the aquifer, correct?
Correct. Well, the town can't change what's already happened. They can prevent more of that happening in those same areas.
So for example, the ordinance refers to where you can't store hazardous substances on the land above an aquifer, correct?
Correct.
You can't store petroleum products in the land above an aquifer, correct?
Correct.
And clearly, if this parcel that is seeking to be developed were above an aquifer, you would not be able to build a power plant on it, correct?
That's correct.
Madam Chair, I have a motion I'd like to make at this time. I'd like to ask that the Energy Facility Siting Board order Invenergy and the town to jointly go through the procedure set forth in the town's ordinance for more specifically identifying the boundaries of the A80 aquifer. That procedure is set forth in section 3-202 entitled Aquifer Zoning, subpart B, subpart C. And it says, as you've seen in the testimony previously, where the bounds of the aquifer zones are in doubt or in dispute, as delineated by the overlay map, the burden of proof and all associated expenses shall be borne by the owners of the land in question to show where said aquifer zones are properly located. At the request of the landowners, the town shall engage, at the owner's expense, a professional hydrogeologist or a soil scientist to determine more accurately the location and extent of the aquifer zone.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
An initial question. Is the owner of the property present?
The owner of the property is not present, but the Invenergy has rights in those properties as shown by the option agreement they have. And my feeling would be that if they want to develop on this property, if they've indicated that the owner has joined with them on all of their zoning and planning applications to the town as they have and signed off on them, it would be their burden to get the owner, which I assume the Invenergy would fund it for the owner. But yet, yes, the owner would have to sign it. And I recognize that the landowner is not making this request. That's why I'm making this motion, because I feel this board should make this request. It's so vitally important. There could be an aquifer directly underneath the parcel that is seeking to be developed as a power plant. If there is, you can't put a power plant on it. You just can't. We need to know whether it is or it isn't. There's a procedure laid out for doing that. It's a procedure that was recommended when this was originally done years ago. It's a procedure that's been incorporated into our zoning law, and we're more than happy to cooperate with Invenergy, with Spectre, which I think is now called Enbridge, to do this. But we believe that the board should order that it be done so that it removes any doubt one way or another as to whether or not this proposed plant would be built over an aquifer that supplies the town's wells.
I'd like to hear from Invenergy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you pointed out, first of all, the property owner isn't a party to this proceeding. That's not a flippant answer, that's just a fact. We're not in any way diminishing the obvious concern about this. We're as concerned as anyone else about ensuring that our projects don't cause an adverse impact. With that said, from a procedural perspective, as Director Coit pointed out, Mr. Raymond specifically raised this issue in his surrebuttal testimony, which was filed September 27th of last year. If Mr. McElroy wanted to make such a motion, because they not only raised this issue, the issue they've created about Mr. Raymond's disagreement with his own aquifer overlay map. They even raised the issue of that particular section of the ordinance, which, again, from our perspective, doesn't apply. But in any event, all of this was raised almost a year ago. That is when this motion, if Mr. McElroy thought it was appropriate, should have been filed. not in the midst of the hearing.
I don't dispute that it could have been filed sooner. On the other hand, this board shouldn't say, well, because one of the parties didn't file it as soon as they should have, we shouldn't look at this issue and endanger the possibility of the public health and safety.
There are going to be additional, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No, I was finished. Go ahead.
We are going to have additional witnesses on water at this site in any event. But with that said, again, the rules, and the rules with respect to prejudice and timing aren't there as guidelines. They're rules. Mr. McElroy, if he was really serious about this issue, not just should have, would have filed such a motion, because as you all know, maybe not Ms. Brady because she's new to this soiree, but certainly the others on this board know, the opponents to this project have not in the least bit hesitated about filing motions whenever they thought it was appropriate or convenient. This motion was never filed, despite the fact that they created this issue almost a year ago.
At the appropriate time, after this discussion is over, CLF would also like to be heard on the matter.
May I?
I'm assuming because this microphone is still on, Mr. Blazer has something else to say.
I keep forgetting to turn it off. I apologize.
That's right.
Mr. Blazer is talking about an untimely made motion and prejudice. It's CLF's view that this issue has inured in the case for at least a year since Mr. Raymond's testimony has been filed, and that the burden of showing that every element of the statute has been met, which is both a burden of production and a burden of persuasion, has remained with Invenergy at all times. I don't know what the board is going to rule on Mr. McElroy's motion, but even if the motion is denied, the burden remains on Invenergy. There is a dispute. Mr. Blazer wants to say there isn't a dispute about the nature of the overlay zone, but we've heard from the witness there's a dispute. And at the end of the hearing, CLF, if there's no hydrological study that's done, and Invenergy can do a hydrological study without a motion from Mr. McElroy in order to satisfy its burden, without an order by the EFSB in order to satisfy its burden, that burden is on Invenergy. And if they don't satisfy the burden, there'll be a motion at the end of the hearing to deny the permit because they haven't satisfied their burden of proof. Mr. Blazer wants to say there's no dispute, but there is a dispute. And unless that dispute is addressed respectfully, the board won't be able to grant a permit, and if it does, there'll be an error of law that'll give rise to an appeal. So regardless of the board's ruling, I think it would be in Invenergy's interest to get that hydrological survey done.
If I may, Madam Chair, I think there's an easy solution to this. I must say this is not the first time I've heard Mr. Elmer threaten appeals. We can address that at some other time. But as you all know, I have, as a representative of Invenergy,
I don't consider appealing even one of mine to be a threat.
all right. Touche. As you all know, I've never hesitated to suggest appropriate conditions where they can satisfy budding concerns. So I am prepared to commit
that if this board ultimately deems it appropriate to grant this permit application, we would accept, not only would we accept, we would request a condition that that approval be conditioned on a hydrogeological study to confirm that no part of this facility will in fact impact the AAD basin. And I think that would allay any concerns without the need for an untimely motion.
I do think that that is an approach, but I think it puts the cart and the horse in the wrong spot. It's really unique, the powers that have been given to this board. On this power plant matter, this board is sitting as the zoning board of the town of Burrillville, making all the zoning board decisions. You're sitting as the planning board. You're sitting as the building inspector, because you're going to be eventually issuing a permit. You need this information. Should I have asked for it sooner? Yes, I'll concede that. Is my brother being generous, I think, by saying he'll do it if he gets his permit as a condition? I think that's a nice way to put it off till later. I think what this board needs is it needs to see what the facts are out in the field. I don't think it's a huge burden to do this. We're not asking that the hearings be suspended. We're simply asking that they get some hydrogeologists out there, do some drilling, and then tell this board, before it goes ahead to issue a permit, whether or not it's in the AAD zone and might adversely impact the water aquifer. We think that this board should want that, even if Mike McElroy didn't ask for it as quickly as he should have. This board needs it. Thank you.
A couple of final words, Madam Chair. First of all, if you accept our proposal, this facility doesn't get built unless there's certainty that we're not in the overlay zone. Second, you already have in the record evidence from Mr. Lipsitz that based on the best available information available today, we are not in that zone. That's why the border of this site was redrawn to move away from any impact on the zone, again, based on the best information we have today. So the information you have today, based on the map that the town provides, that by ordinance and statute we are required to rely on, we are not in that zone. So I believe our offer goes well above it. And the only dispute we've heard of today with respect to where this zone is, and the one that's created by Mr. Raymond, casting doubt on the town's own map. Fine. There is now a dispute because Mr. Raymond created it. We can deal with it in a very easy way by conditioning this permit. As you all know, any condition on a permit that is not complied with prevents the facility from being built. So the concern that Mr. McElroy has raised, which from a local perspective I understand and frankly I agree with, they need to understand that it's going to be safe, as do you. Conditioning the permit on a hydrogeological study that confirms we're not over the aquifer completely resolves that concern. We can't build if we don't prove it to you.
Well, Madam Chair, that may be it. If what my brother is saying, and his last words were, we don't prove it to you, we don't build. If he's making a commitment that that condition will read that no construction is to begin, no ground clearing, nothing is to happen on that site, unless and until that work is done to determine whether it's in the AAD zone, then on behalf of the town, I would accept that.
The only ground clearing we would have to do would be ground clearing to allow the equipment on site to be able to conduct the study.
That's understood.
So, yes, I will make that commitment.
We have a resolution if it's acceptable to the board.
Well, no, I think that it's actually, you did propose a motion, and I don't think it's something that I am going to decide on my own. I think it's appropriate just to get my fellow commission board members.
First,
And if you don't think that you're ready to decide it, we can put off the decision too.
okay, or maybe, given what you just said, Mr. McElroy, I don't know if you're thinking about withdrawing the motion, that's, so I'll just put that on there, since you seem like you just made an agreement. But first, I just, for the record, I mean, this was raised, and the notes on the map itself that was referenced say, this table is intended only as a guide and should not be used as a substitute for exploratory test drilling. So that's page 13 of the survey. So I think it's an issue that was vetted in many of the documents. I do want to note that we have in early September, on the 5th, we do have a day where we have witnesses on groundwater and surface water. So I would prefer not, if the motion still is alive, I would prefer to ask some more questions of those witnesses, and then that's a little over a month from now, I realize, but make a decision then, or just think about it a little bit more. But I think we have some experts coming on that very topic.
I believe what Director Coitus just said as potentially a good solution. Again, there is the option to withdraw the motion if you so choose. Part of the question is there a benefit to doing it now as opposed to doing it later, or to doing it in a few months? I don't know that we can answer that question today, but I want to make it clear, just from the discussion that we've been having, I'd like to point out, I think for the record, that this would be a study to see whether there was an effect on the aquifer, not just on the zoning itself, on the A80 zone. I just want to make that very clear, that that's what needs to be investigated potentially. But we do have experts coming in early September, and I believe that they will offer us some additional answers that would potentially be beneficial in framing what might need to be done.
Could I just ask for, and I'm not sure which one of you, so I think I'll ask you, Mr. Blazer, to restate what was the offer and acceptance that we heard. I think it was...
Oh boy. Mike, help me out here. I think we have an agreement.
Do you want the reporter to try and find what you said?
Potentially. But we can try and restate it just so we make sure.
I can try. My understanding is that Invenergy has agreed that as a condition of its permit, that if this board issues a permit, that the condition will say that no construction, with the exception of whatever clearing is necessary in order to do the hydrologic study, no construction will begin unless and until a professional hydrogeologist has done a hydrologic study to determine exactly what the location of the A80 zone is on this property, and determine that it is not underneath the proposed lot.
And as Ms. Brady said, we're talking about the aquifer itself, not the A80 zone.
If I may, I'm sorry, because I think what we're talking about is, even though we disagree that it applies, is the procedure that's in this section of the ordinance, appeal of designation, and Mr. McElroy. At the request of the landowners, the town shall engage, but we're actually going to flip it around. We will do it as a condition of the permit at the owner's expense, and it won't be Algonquin, it'll be us, a professional hydrogeologist or a soil scientist to determine more accurately the location and extent of the aquifer zone. Obviously, we're not going to map the entire A80 zone. We will study to determine whether or not any portion of our site would impact that zone. And I agree with Mr. McElroy, we would not commence any physical construction whatsoever of any kind, other than, again, clearing to allow the equipment that would conduct this investigation, until such time as that report confirmed that our site would not impact that zone.
And I would just like to reiterate what Ms. Brady said, that we're talking about the actual aquifer, not the overlay map of the zone.
I'm sorry, but first of all, this is a matter between us and the town, not CLF. Number two, the issue is the overlay zone. Not any groundwater anywhere. That's the issue that Mr. Raymond has raised, the overlay zone. If you couldn't build something in this state, if there was any water anywhere under your site, nothing could ever be built. That's why what we're talking about is the A80 zone. And that's, I believe, the agreement that Mr. McElroy and I have reached, which I believe moots his motion.
Well, I'm not withdrawing the motion. On the other hand, I think we've got a reasonable solution, although we might be picking at words just a little bit. It's the ordinance requires the determination, the accurate determination of the location and extent of the aquifer zone. And I think that's what my brother is offering to do. And to determine whether or not the aquifer zone lies in any part underneath the proposed lot.
That is correct.
Okay. If that's what we're looking for, that I am in agreement with that, although I do not at this point in time want to withdraw the motion.
We are certainly willing to agree to that. I think we have an agreement.
Yes, and I think that we are well advised to wait until the September 5th hearing date where we have more witnesses who are actually going to be talking about it in a so I recognize that the motion is outstanding. We're not going to rule on it before September 5th.
I make one more point. I do know that we've got water experts coming in, no question about that. But to my knowledge, there is no testimony that's been filed by any parties on this particular issue, other than the testimony you've already seen. So I get the idea about cross-examination of those witnesses, examination from the board members and other parties. Maybe more could be fleshed out. But none of those witnesses, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Blazer, but I don't believe any of those witnesses have addressed the A80 aquifer zone.
They haven't. We obviously have not done a hydrogeo study. There are water witnesses coming. It may flesh some of this out. I agree with Director Coit. That's a possibility. We don't have any objection to putting this over until you have a little more evidence to see if you need more or if the agreement that Mr. McElroy and I have reached is acceptable. We both agree that it is, but it's a concern. I agree with it, so I'm agreeing to the, you don't need my agreement, but I agree with Director Coit anyway. I think it makes sense until at least you hear those witnesses so you can determine in your own minds. You might decide we don't need a study. I doubt it, but you might.
If it's possible to agree with both of you. I can agree with you, Mr. Blazer, because you're agreeing with me. I think you're right, Mr. McElroy, that we're not going to hear more about what we're talking about is the 880 aquifer overlay and how it intersects with your zoning. But to the point that the board member Brady made, the larger concern is any impacts on the aquifer. So let's wait for that. It's not going to make it's not going to really change anything to wait and we'll have to hear that.
The only thing I would suggest from a procedural perspective, I don't think we need to brief this. I think we all understand what it is. This docket already has enough paper, unless my brother, Mr. McElroy, thinks otherwise. I think we all understand what the issues are.
I do not think it's necessary. I believe I have concluded my redirect.
And I am certainly not going to suggest briefing. I do want to say as politely as I can that as a matter of law, Mr. Blazer is mistaken about CLF not being heard on pending matters. CLF is a full party in this proceeding. CLF has the same appeal rights as any other full party in this proceeding, and trying to shush up CLF's attorney is not going to work.
Okay, where are we now?
Recross. We can still remember there's a witness up there. If I may, Madam Chair, just a few questions. Mr. Raymond, could you still have the zoning ordinance there, right?
I do, yes.
Page 310, the dimensional regulations. And both Ms. Brady and I believe one of the other attorneys had asked you about height limits with respect to the structures on this proposed project. You remember that?
Yes.
This proposed project. You've got me saying calling it. I'm curious about something. If you look at this page and the ones following, so you see it's separated by zoning district. You've got F5 and then blanks across, and then below it there are uses. Same with F2, R40, etc. You see that?
Yes, again, like I say, I'm not familiar with looking this up on the computer.
You have your version.
The typical zoning ordinance that was done by the Florida company that handles zoning ordinances.
Right, right. But it reads the same. It may look a little bit different. Yeah. Let's all hope so, because this is the link I followed on your website. So here's the question I have. Let's look, for example, before we go to F5, go to the next one, F2. That's farming residential district also, but it's a different kind of district, right?
Well, they're both farming residential.
Right.
One is 2 acre zoning, one's 5
Five.
acres.
Okay.
Size more than anything.
Other than that, they're essentially the same?
They're a little different, but I think you'll find more similarities between F5 and F2 than other residential districts.
So, in the F2, you'll see below that, because when you go below the actual designation of the district, it talks about what dimensional limits apply to particular uses in that district. Do you see that? So for example, below the F2, it says single-family dwelling and any other permitted use. You see that?
Correct.
And then you can run across the table to see what the limits are for the various dimensions. Or if you look at, on the next page, VC Village Commercial District. There's any permitted commercial use, any residential use, and then you've got a series of dimensional limits across the rest of the table, right? And you can see all of them, as you go through, talk about potentially a specific use, and then the word any for other uses. Do you see that? Any residential use, any permitted commercial use. Do you see all of those?
Yes.
All right. If we go back to the F5, it's on page 310. The only use to which the dimensional limits apply is single-family dwelling, farming, or animal raising. There's no mention of any other permitted or permitted by special use in those dimensional limits. You see that? There's no any, like all the other ones. Do you agree with me?
There is none there. I didn't look at all of them and see if any other ones doesn't say that either.
Could you go through those for me?
Sure.
I have, and I see any in all of them, but I'd like you to satisfy yourself.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes.
All right. Is there any other place in the zoning ordinance where I would find height limits applicable, other than this, where I would find height limits applicable to an electric generating facility?
No.
All right. In response, I believe, I've lost track, so I do apologize. I believe this was in response to some of Mr. McElroy's questions about one facility versus two. And you had said, I believe you said it was your sense about what you believe to be the meaning of the definition of electric generating facility, right?
I think as we said earlier this morning, the fact that, you know, words have a meaning. And
Right.
I think if it were meant to be more than that, it would have been put into the language in the ordinance.
You do recall that one of the things we went over this morning, for example, is the definitions of various types of dwellings.
Yes.
And they specifically call out numerical limitations, right? Single-family dwelling is 1 unit, two-family dwelling is 2 units, multifamily dwelling is 3 or more,
Yes.
right? And just to reiterate, there is no such numerical limitation anywhere in this ordinance that says electrical generating facility is limited to 1 turbine, correct?
There's no language that says that, no.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for this witness?
I'm thinking.
Yeah. Some more.
Listening to what Dr. Raymond, no further questions, Madam Chair.
Mr. McElroy?
Nothing further, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Mr. Weezer. May I have this?
Of course. You want the PDF version?
This is fine. This is fine. Save me a few copies. Now I'm interested in following it through and see how the other ordinance go here.
Is there anything else we need to do, council, before? All right, then we're going to recess the hearing until August 15th at 9:30. See you then.
Thank you.